What if the reality you're experiencing right now, this very moment, isn't some fixed external thing, but a constantly updating projection of consciousness itself?
Hmm.
Think about that for a second. Today, on the deep dive, we're venturing into a truly ambitious and mind-expanding framework called the theory of nothing, or ToN. It comes straight from the Science-Delic white paper.
And what's fascinating right off the bat is that this isn't just a minor tweak, you know?
Yeah.
It's a really bold proposition. It flips our conventional view of reality completely on its head.
Absolutely. And our mission for you, the learner, is to unpack this pretty complex theory in a way that's clear, engaging, and gives you the essential insights without getting totally lost in the super technical weeds.
Yeah, we want you to walk away with a solid grasp of this, well, radical perspective. Maybe even have a few aha moments along the way.
Right. So to be clear, we're diving into a white paper by Eliam Raell and the Pleroma Philosophical Research Society and Sanctuary for Unification of Consciousness.
Quite a name.
It is. Their work explores a universe where consciousness isn't a byproduct of matter, but the very ground of being, the foundation.
Exactly. So to get our heads around this, we'll be focusing on three key concepts the paper introduces.
Yes. Consciousness itself, which they denote with the Greek letter Phi.
See, okay.
And then awareness, represented by Phi.
Vive, got it.
And resolution, symbolized by lambda. We'll see how these three interact in their model to, well, create the reality we perceive.
Okay, so the core idea, the thing that immediately jumps out is this. Consciousness, that universal A. It isn't something that magically appears when matter gets complex enough.
No, exactly. This theory suggests it's the fundamental starting point.
It's a substrate.
Yes, the white paper proposes that A is the underlying fabric of everything. They talk about the void not as like utter emptiness, but as pure, unmanifest potential.
Right.
And from this void, universal consciousness, A arises through a fundamental act of self-reflection. It's almost like it asks itself, what am I? And that initial self-awareness is the very spark of existence in this model.
And from that foundational universal consciousness, we get these three key players, the core components you mentioned. Can you outline those again for us?
Sure. First, there's S, Jess. That's the universal, undifferentiated consciousness, pure self-reflective awareness. They sometimes call it the monad, like one single cosmic awareness.
Okay, the big picture consciousness.
Exactly. Then we have Thek. That represents localized awareness, individual centers of consciousness.
Like us.
Like us, yeah. Think of these as self-referential nodes. The paper suggests these could manifest as anything from you and me to a rock or even a star. It's about points of identity or matter within the larger field.
So S is the overarching field, or the individual points of awareness within it. And how does lambda fit into this?
Okay, lambda is the rendering speed. Or you could call it space-time resolution. It's what dictates how that unmanifest potential, guided by A, actually shows up as the reality we experience.
So like the refresh rate of the universe.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it as the level of detail and the frequency at which the universe is, in a sense, being generated or rendered.
That's a powerful image. The idea that space-time itself has a kind of frame rate.
It is. And to make this a bit more concrete, the white paper uses a really helpful analogy.
Oh, good. Analogies help.
Definitely. Imagine a sophisticated video game engine that's in the underlying system.
Okay, the engine.
You, the player, or maybe your avatar in the game, that's in. Your localized point of awareness and interaction within that system.
Right, me playing a game.
And the game's graphics settings, or its frame rate, that's in. It determines how detailed and smooth your experience of the game world is.
Ah, okay. That analogy really helps make those abstract ideas much easier to grasp. The engine, the player, the graphic setting.
Pretty much.
So how do these three core components actually interact then to create what we experience as real?
Well, the theory suggests that your localized awareness emerges as a kind of focused projection from the universal consciousness. But this projection isn't limitless. It happens under the constraints imposed by the resolution. They even put it concisely. A is like F focusing itself, but limited by F.
So my individual awareness isn't totally separate from the universal pool.
Yeah.
It's more like a specific way that universal consciousness is experiencing itself. Filtered through the level of detail, the lambda.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And they discuss something called monad void dynamics.
Monad void dynamics, okay.
Which is this continuous interplay between the pure potential of the void and the pure awareness of S. It's this constant interaction, this back and forth, that drives the emergence of S and the reality we perceive.
Huh. And there's even a mathematical relationship they propose to link these concepts, isn't there?
Yes, they present an equation.
F A A A A A.
Psi equals phi times lambda squared. What does that mean, though, in plain terms?
Right. It suggests that how rich and detailed our experience feels, what they call phenomenal density, increases with the amount of localized awareness, and crucially, by the square of the rendering resolution. The square. So lambda has a really big impact.
A very big impact. And they even provide units. A and Astea are in bits, which you can think of as fundamental units of information or awareness.
Bits, like in computing.
Sort of, yeah, fundamental information units. While arraign is in hertz, or cycles per second, indicating a rate, like a frequency.
Okay, so even a subtle increase in lambda, the resolution, could lead to a really significant jump in the richness of perceived reality, even if the localized awareness stays the same.
Exactly. That's a key takeaway for understanding how our experience might be shaped by this rendering speed. It really emphasizes its crucial role.
Interesting.
Now, beyond this central equation, the white paper explores some other fascinating functional dynamics, things that happen because of this core setup.
Okay, like what?
Well, they mention a memory field.
A memory field.
Yeah, which they describe as integrated patterns of I/O over time. The idea is that our past experiences, those moments of localized awareness, aren't just gone. They contribute to this ongoing field of information.
Like a persistent record.
Kind of. And then there's temporal entropy, expressed as S equals minus psi times the natural log of lambda, entropy. So, disorder.
Right. This suggests a connection between universal consciousness, the resolution of reality, and the concept of disorder, or maybe the arrow of time. Interestingly, if the resolution decreases, the entropy S in this formula would seem to increase.
That's an intriguing link. Tying consciousness itself to the direction of time. Wow. Okay, what else? They also talk about observation recursion.
Yes, this is the concept of the universal consciousness interacting with localized awareness at various levels of resolution.
So, like, consciousness looking at itself.
Pretty much. Imagine consciousness observing itself at different degrees of detail, creating a feedback loop that ultimately shapes our experience, recursively.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about this ego potential? That sounds particularly relevant to our sense of self.
It really does. The ego potential is defined simply as
Ego
equals psi minus phi.
Yes. It's presented as the pension or the difference between the vastness of universal awareness and our individual localized awareness. The theory suggests this gap might be directly related to the feeling of being a separate individual.
Ah, so the feeling of me-ness is the difference between my local awareness and the whole cosmic awareness.
That's the idea presented here. So for you, the learner, your sense of you-ness might be, in this framework, a measure of that difference.
That's a compelling way to think about the ego. Now, the white paper also introduces what they call the master reality functional. That sounds important, like the central mathematical expression of the entire theory.
It is certainly ambitious. It looks quite complex. The core equation is represented as an integral.
Let me see. Thorio? Thoria 3? 3 equals the integral from emin to mekinax of emp times the natural log of emi micheli nekio times WWDA.
Okay, whoa, let's try to get the gist of that without getting totally bogged down in the calculus. What is this functional trying to describe in broad strokes? Think of it as the ultimate recipe for reality, the learner. That's maybe the best way to put it. This functional aims to mathematically capture the entire process by which reality is generated.
The whole process.
The whole thing, yeah. It takes into account universal consciousness, your individual awareness, and the whole range of possible resolutions at which reality can be rendered, from minimum to maximum.
And what are some of the key ingredients in this recipe?
Well, you have the empirical mapping, EMP. That's basically how EMP manifests based on M and EP. Then there's a weight function, W, which seems to be there to help ensure the math works out properly. It gives it mathematical integrity.
Okay.
And the boundary domain, Mn and Mx, which just sets the limits for the possible range of resolution, the slowest and fastest rendering speeds, if you like.
Right. And perhaps most interestingly, the white paper attempts to connect this very abstract framework to established science. You mentioned deriving quantum mechanics and general relativity limits.
Yes. That's a significant claim, trying to bridge this consciousness-centric view with the foundations of modern physics.
How do they propose that works?
Well, they suggest that at the quantum limit, where lambda is at its maximum possible value, think highest resolution, smallest scales. Their empirical mapping equation essentially boils down to something that looks like Einstein's famous energy-momentum relation. E equals E species plus mc to dxc.
Wow. So the physics of the very small might emerge from this consciousness framework at maximum resolution.
That's the implication they're aiming for, yeah. A potential link between their framework and fundamental quantum laws.
That's a huge connection to try and make. What about the other end, the classical everyday scale limit?
In the classical limit, as lambda approaches infinity, which represents a very high resolution, like the smooth world we perceive, they suggest their main reality functional converges towards the Einstein-Hilbert action.
Which is the basis of general relativity.
Yeah.
Einstein's theory of gravity.
Exactly. So this theory isn't just abstract philosophy. It's attempting to root itself in the established laws of physics by showing how those laws might emerge as limiting cases of its core principles.
That's crucial. And they also mention a connection to neuroscience, trying to link AA and to brain activity.
They do. They draw parallels between their universal consciousness and something called IIT. That's Integrated Information Theory's measure of consciousness in the brain.
Okay, IIT. I've heard of that.
And they link their IA localized awareness to neural assemblies, groups of neurons firing together, and resolution. They connect to the brain's perceptual update rate, how fast we process sensory information.
These connections are vital if they ever want to actually test the theory, which brings us to the proposed experimental operators and the whole idea of testability. How do they envision putting this framework to the test in a lab?
Good question. They propose specific operators. Think of them as experimental tools or methods. First, there's a neuro operator. This would aim to measure that integrated information array, or maybe IIT as a proxy, using things like EEG and fMRI brain scans.
Okay, measuring the consciousness level.
Kind of.
Okay.
Second, a VR operator. This is designed to measure things like flicker fusion thresholds, how quickly flashing lights need to blink before we see them as continuous. That gives them a way to try and quantify the resolution.
Measuring the rendering speed.
Exactly. And finally, a digital physics operator. This involves using computer simulations to model localized awareness.
So these are intended as ways to get actual measurable data that corresponds to their theoretical concepts, a to vita.
That's the goal. And they've even outlined a 3-phase roadmap for validating the entire theory.
A roadmap. Okay, what are the phases?
Phase I is all about lab calibration, basically, trying to match their mathematical descriptions with real-world measurements using those operators.
Makes sense. Phase 1, get the measurements.
Phase 2 focuses on formal derivation. This means rigorously, mathematically showing how their framework can actually reproduce the known limits of quantum mechanics and general relativity.
The hard math part.
You could say that. And phase 3 involves cross-disciplinary testing, comparing the theory's predictions with things like cosmological observations, and also just opening it up for critical examination by the wider scientific community.
Right, see if it holds up to scrutiny from different fields. And they highlight a specific falsifiable prediction, don't they? Which is crucial for any scientific theory.
Yes. They predict that when someone meditates and reports increased lucidity, a state of heightened awareness or clarity, this subjective experience should be preceded by measurable increases in IITA in their brain scans.
Preceded by it, so the brain measure changes before the person feels lucid.
That's the prediction. And crucially, they say this should happen regardless of any manipulations they might do to the rendering resolution, like using flashing lights or VR.
Ah, so it isolates the eye component's role in lucidity. That's a concrete prediction you could actually test in a lab. Either it happens that way or it doesn't.
Exactly. It offers a tangible way to potentially support or challenge a key aspect of the theory.
Okay. Now, beyond the core mechanics and testing, the white paper also delves into a phenomenological typology. That sounds like trying to categorize different states of being within their framework.
Yeah, basically. They introduce concepts like a player versus an NPC.
They like in the video game analogy.
Exactly. A player represents a lucid agent, someone with a flexible or responsive localized awareness. Maybe their eye can change more easily. An NPC, a non-player character, is described as a more fixed entity, maybe stuck in a loop, with a less dynamic eye.
Interesting. And MPs play into this too.
Yes, the level of universal consciousness and the resolution also influence these states.
And they propose some intriguing laws governing transitions between these states, like the law of recursive awakening.
Right. This law, they write it as derive.
Okay, derivative of psi with respect to phi greater than lambda.
Yeah, it suggests that a moment of increased awareness or lucidity happens when the rate of change or expansion of universal consciousness relative to your localized awareness exceeds the current level of rendering resolution.
So if your connection to the universal grows faster than the frame rate, you wake up more.
That's the idea. It's like hitting a threshold for waking up to a greater reality within the model.
Huh. And the law of rendering collapse. That sounds pretty profound.
It does. It states that as the rendering resolution approaches zero, the combined influence of universal and localized awareness tends towards the void.
Back to the unmanifest potential.
A return to that potential, yeah.
Wow. They also touch upon potential transition maps for various states of consciousness.
Yeah.
Like death, dreaming, enlightenment.
They do. For example, they suggest death could be the process of your localized awareness fading away, essentially going to zero, leading to a reabsorption into the universal consciousness.
The return to the source.
In their model, yes. Dreaming is characterized by a lower and more unstable rendering resolution, and a less stable render. Makes sense. Dreams can be fuzzy and disjointed.
Yeah.
Lucid states, as we mentioned, involve that key relationship, an enlightenment. Well, that's presented as a state where your individual awareness merges back with universal consciousness approaches.
So the distinction dissolves.
Exactly. And the need for a distinct resolution essentially collapses. It represents a direct union, a direct connection. They even have a concept of an ego reboot.
Ego reboot, like restarting your computer.
Kind of. It's where the resolution resets and a new localized awareness comes into being or instantiates.
This attempt to map subjective experiences, dreaming, lucidity, even death and enlightenment onto their fundamental framework, redigrio, is a crucial part of making the theory feel comprehensive, maybe even relatable.
Definitely. Now, to make sure the whole thing holds together logically, the white paper also discusses internal coherence and patches.
Patches, like software patches.
Sort of, yeah. These structural patches are basically adjustments or axioms designed to make sure the science-delic model is logically sound and mathematically consistent. Self-contained.
Okay. What are some core ideas they emphasize for coherence?
Well, core axioms like consciousness is fundamental. That's non-negotiable for the theory. And the core relationship we keep coming back to. Reality, A. Reality is projecting us under the condition of A. They also introduce dynamical equations that describe how A and A change over time.
And you mentioned something about a shift in the type of mathematics they use.
Yes, briefly. They mention exploring a shift away from traditional continuum mathematics, like calculus on smooth spaces, towards discrete causal networks. Things like Wolfram hypergraphs are mentioned.
Why the shift?
Potentially because reality at its most fundamental level might be discrete, not smooth, like pixels on a screen rather than a continuous image. It might be a more suitable language for a rendered reality model.
Interesting. A different mathematical toolkit.
And one more thing for internal consistency. They propose replacing the traditional concept of energy with something they call A intensity, defined as E in the self.
Replacing energy itself.
Yeah, grounding everything, even energy, within their consciousness-centric view. It helps make the model self-contained, not relying on external concepts like energy from physics in the standard way.
Okay. Finally, the white paper includes a section on perspectives on the model, giving a glimpse into how different thinkers might evaluate this whole framework.
Exactly. It's a fascinating snapshot, kind of a self-assessment of potential reception.
So what do they find? How might different viewpoints react?
Well, they rated it from different angles. A hypothetical materialist physicist gives it a 7 out of 10. They might appreciate its internal elegance, the math maybe, but would point out the crucial need for more concrete experimental evidence, those bridges to measurement.
Understandable from that perspective?
An idealist philosopher, on the other hand, gives it a perfect 10 out of 10. They might see it as a brilliant, modern synthesis of historical idealist thought, like merging Plotinus with, say, John Wheeler's It from Bit.
Okay, so the philosophers who already lean towards consciousness being fundamental would love it.
Pretty much. A consciousness researcher rates it very highly, maybe 9.5 out of 10, because it offers potential models for tricky phenomena like near-death experiences, lucid dreaming, ego dissolution things standard models struggle with.
Right, it speaks directly to their subject matter.
And interestingly, a mystic veteran, someone with deep contemplative experience, also gives it a 10 out of 10. They might find resonance between the framework and ancient spiritual traditions or yogic texts, just expressed in the language of modern science, like yogic sutras meet tensor calculus.
Huh. That's quite a description. These different perspectives really highlight the model's potential and maybe its challenge trying to bridge such diverse fields of inquiry: science, philosophy, subjective experience.
It really underscores the ambitious and incredibly interdisciplinary nature of this theory. It's attempting to speak to scientific, philosophical, and even mystical viewpoints all at once.
Okay, so to wrap it all up then, the central idea of the theory of nothing, as laid out in the Science-Adelic white paper, is, well, it's a radical one.
It really is. It suggests that consciousness isn't just something that arises from the physical world,
No.
but it's the very foundation, the ground of being upon which our reality is rendered.
And this rendering process involves the dynamic interplay of universal consciousness
Your localized awareness.
and the resolution of spacetime, all connected through these formal equations and proposed relationships.
Exactly. The Science-Adelic model is incredibly ambitious. It aims to provide a unified way of understanding everything from the origins of the cosmos to the complexities of our own minds, maybe even the nature of computation.
Ultimately seeking to bridge that age-old gap between our inner subjective experiences and the objective world we seem to observe around us.
Yeah. And while it's clearly still a developing framework, maybe speculative in parts, it presents a really compelling set of ideas. And it even proposes ways to test its claims empirically.
Which could potentially open up entirely new avenues for research in fields like artificial intelligence consciousness, maybe psychospiritual diagnostics, or even our fundamental understanding of quantum ontology, the nature of reality itself.
So for you, the learner, here's a final thought to carry with you. If your reality is fundamentally a rendering of consciousness, what does that imply about the true nature and the ultimate potential of your own awareness?
That's definitely something to mull over.
It is. Perhaps it will even inspire you to delve deeper into the original white paper or explore these fascinating concepts further on your own.